Okay, now we're going to talk about probability relative frequency. By the end of this video, you would have filled in some data here. Now, relative frequency is a very important thing to think about, and it fits in the probability section. Right? Let's have a look at this. Relative frequency is a percentage of how often something happens divided by the total outcomes. Right? So it's a percentage. We know that because it's probability. It's how often something happens divided by the total amount of times it could have happened. Right? So what is the probability of a dice landing on 1? That probability is 1 in 6 chances. Right? That is very easy. This is not relative frequency. We know that a dice has 6 options, and we want to know what the probability of it landing on one of those options is, and that's 1/6. What if I were to ask you, however, what is the probability of the next car driving past your window being blue? Right? This is impossible to answer. It is impossible to know what that next car is, or it is possible to make a guess of the percent chance or percent probability that that next car could be blue. What if you are parked next to a DHL service? It is a high chance that the next car is going to be yellow, not blue. So it is not something you can do without any data. What if I said, what is the probability of you winning your next soccer game? And that's the question I asked. I didn't know anything about how good your team was or how bad your team was. It is impossible to make a guess about the percent chance or the percent probability for you to win your next soccer game. So it is so important that relative frequency is relative to history. So relative frequency is relative to history. What if I told you that the last 10 cars that drove past my window were blue? The probability is going to be higher that it's blue. What if I told you that we had won 10 out of 10 of our games? The probability of you winning is 100%. So just remember, the probability is just a guide. It is not going to determine the result. It's only a prediction for the result. Let's have a look at this example. In a year, you played 20 games of soccer and won 16 of them. Your relative frequency, your frequency of winning is 16. You've won 16 times. How often did it happen? However, how often did it not happen? Your relative frequency of winning, however, is 16 over 20, which is 80%. So frequency is simply how often something happens without the total outcomes, and relative frequency is how often something happens, that's that over there, divided by the total amount of times it could have happened. You could have won 20 times, but you only won 16. Right, let's look at this example. I have opened a bag of blue, green, and red sweets. I don't know how many of each sweet color there is in there. I have so far picked out 12 blue sweets, 6 green sweets, and 2 red sweets. What is the relative frequency of getting or of a blue sweet? The relative frequency of a blue sweet is 12 because we have 12 blue sweets divided by the total number of sweets. So remember, probability is the likelihood of something happening or the total times it happened over the total amount of times it could have happened. You could have got a sweet all 20 times, or all of these times here. But you didn't. You only got it for 12. So it's 12 plus the total, which is 12 plus 6 plus 2. And that is equal to 12 over 20, and that is equal to 60%. What is the frequency of getting a green sweet? It's the same total at the bottom, but now you only got 6 green sweets. So that frequency will be 6 over 20, which is 30%. What about red sweet? You can quite see that this has to add up to 100. And here it's 60, and here it's 30. So what's 4 over 20? That's 10%. So what if I had picked 200 sweets, and the relative frequency of getting a blue sweet was now 32%? How many blue sweets would I have? So this is the question, ignoring everything in the top. If I had 200 sweets, the relative frequency of getting a blue sweet was 32%. So this 32% was here, right? How many blue sweets would I have? So 32% means that for every 100 sweets I picked, 32 were blue. Over here, 60 were blue for every 100 we would have picked. So how do we work this out? We go 200 times 32%, which on your calculator is 200 times 0.32. Don't forget that. And you would have got 64 blue sweets, which you can see is double 32. Great. So in relative frequency, we learned that relative frequency is the percentage of how often something happens divided by the total number of outcomes, right? So it's divided by there. Relative frequency is how often something happens, so how often, and it's divided by the total amount of times it could have happened, total times. And then the last thing we need to know is that relative frequency is relative to history. It is relative to some historic data we have. When we're throwing a dice, it doesn't matter what the history is, we have the same amount chance every time. And that is relative frequency. Next, we're going to do 10 examples on data handling and probability. Great.